Hi class, this is lesson 8.2, characteristics of quadratic functions. Okay, so the first thing we're going to learn is finding the zeros of a quadratic function. And remember from a couple chapters ago we learned what the zeros are, and the zeros just mean what is the value when y equals 0. So in other words, we're looking for when does the graph cross the x-axis. Okay, so some parabolas will have two zeros. So like in the case of this one, it has two of them, right here and right here. So we would say the zeros are -1 and 3. You might also see it written as an ordered pair. So you might see -1, 0, and 3, 0. Okay, remember we're looking for what's the x value when the y value is 0. So our y value will always be 0. Okay, other parabolas like this next one only have one 0 because it only crosses that x-axis one time. So this one would have a 0 of -4. You could also write that as -4, 0. Now this last one here doesn't have any zeros. We'd say none because it never crosses or touches the y-axis. So no zeros for that one. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is something called the axis of symmetry. And if you remember from probably elementary school, symmetry just means the point, the line that splits the shape in half. So we are looking for what line would split our parabola in half. And that line is always going to go through the vertex. So if you look over here at these graphs, right here would be our axis of symmetry at x equals 3. Remember, x equals something, that's always going to be a vertical line. So that's the line that cuts our parabola in half. Okay, and it's always going to go through the vertex. Okay, now it's really easy if it's graphed like this, and you can pretty easily tell, you know, it's going to go through the vertex. There's only one 0, so it's really easy to tell on those ones. The ones where it may be a little bit more difficult to tell what the axis of symmetry is if there's two zeros. And so we can kind of count over and see in some instances, but sometimes, you know, it may be a little bit more difficult. So if that's the case, what we're going to do is we're going to average up our two zeros. So we're going to find each 0, so -4 and 0, and that's what they put right here. We add those together and then divide by 2, and then that will tell us what our axis of symmetry is. So in this case, our axis of symmetry would be x equals -2. Okay, so that's just a surefire way that will get you the axis of symmetry. If you're not 100% sure, just looking at the graph, or if it's not even graphed for you, you're just given an equation. Okay, so some examples here. This one is going to be like that first example. There's only one 0, and it's got to go through the vertex. So our axis of symmetry would be x equals -1, right through that line right there. Okay, on this next one, we need to find the middle of our zeros. Okay, so you could do it a couple different ways. You can kind of count over, see where the middle would be. Oh, it would be about right here. Okay, now that's not exactly the most accurate thing in the world. It looks like it's at 2.5. Okay, so, but if you're not sure though, and to double check, we can average up our zeros. So our two zeros are -1 and 4, or excuse me, +1 and 4. So +1 plus 4, and then I divide by 2. When I do that, I get 5 over 2, and 5 over 2 is the same as 2.5 if we were to write it as a decimal. So in that case, I did do it right. Okay, and then this next one, I've got my line of symmetry right here. There's only one 0, so that should be at x equals -3 then. Okay, and then my last example here, I can kind of guesstimate where it would be, but it's kind of hard to tell for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and use my averaging formula to figure that out. So I'm going to take my two zeros at -2 and 4, and then divide that by 2. So I should get 2 over 2, which is the same as 1. So x equals 1 should be my axis of symmetry. And so if I go ahead and draw that out, I can see that, yep, that looks pretty accurate. I did it right then. Okay. All right. This next part then says if a function has no zeros or they're difficult to identify from a graph, you can use this formula here to figure out what the axis of symmetry would be. And so then this will work for all quadratic function. So this is what you use if you don't know what the zeros are. Okay, and that'll get you your equation for your axis of symmetry. Okay, so over here, let's look at this first example. First of all, I need to figure out what my a and b values are. So remember, a is whatever's in front of the x squared. So in this case, it would be -3. And b would be 10 in this case. That's whatever in front of your x. Okay, so then I can just plug those into my formula. So I'm going to say x equals -10 over 2 times a. And then when I go ahead and figure that out, I get x equals 2 times -3 is -6. And so I'll have -10 over -6. And then simplify that out, and I'll get a +5 over 3. So my axis of symmetry then would be x equals 5/3. Okay, I'm going to make sure you write that as x equals that number, because remember, our axis of symmetry is a straight line. Okay, so after that example, why don't you go ahead and see if you can do these next two on your own. Remember, first you need to identify your a and b values. And once you've done that, then you just plug it into that formula up top there where the star is. Okay? Okay, then the last thing for today is if we're going to find the vertex of a parabola. So remember, we've got our axis of symmetry, and remember that the axis of symmetry goes through the vertex. So we already have our x value. We just need to find the y value. So once we find the axis of symmetry, that'll be our x value. We're going to just plug that back into that same equation that we're working with. Okay, so on these, we're going to start by finding our axis of symmetry, because that'll give us our x value. Okay, so first of all, I need to know my a and b value. So a is 0.25 and b is 2. Then I can go ahead and plug that into my equation. So remember, my equation is -b over 2a. So plug that in, I'll get x equals -2 over 2 times 0.25. Okay, and so 2 times 0.25, so -2 over 0.5 then. Okay, and then after I figure that out, I should have x equals -4. So I'm halfway done. I've got my x value. That's my axis of symmetry, my x value. Now I just need to find my y value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this x value and plug it back in up here into this equation to find my y. So I'm going to have y equals 0.25 times -4 squared plus 2 times -4 plus 3. So I'm going to punch all that into my calculator. Okay, and once you've plugged all that in, you should get y equals -1. So there's my y value then. So my final answer would be the ordered pair, -4, -1. Okay, so this last one then, let's go ahead and do one more together, and then I'll let you do numbers 3 and 4 on your own. Okay, so this next one, we're going to start with our equation to find the axis of symmetry, so -b over 2a. First of all, we need to identify our a and b value. So a is going to be -3, what's in front of the x squared, and b is going to be 6. Okay, so go ahead and plug that in then. So I'll have -6 over 2 times -3. So -6 over -6 should give me 1. So there's my x value then. So now remember, I'm going to take this x value and I'm going to go and plug it in up top here and solve for y, so I can get my y value. Okay, so I'm going to have y equals -3 times 1 squared plus 6 times 1 minus 7. Okay, and I can go ahead and just plug all of that into my calculator then, and I should get -4. So there's my y value then. So the point that my vertex is at then is this written as an ordered pair. So the point 1, -4. Okay, so go ahead and try numbers 3 and 4 on your own. And then remember, you can always check your answers with my answer key on my website before you get going on your assignment. Good luck.